Associate Professor at Faculty of Law, and also the Director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law. Her research on transnational environmental law currently focuses on climate change litigation. So Jolene, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Chan. Can you see my slides properly?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about my research. As Professor Chan has said, I'm working at the Faculty of Law at NUS, and I'm currently working on a book on climate change litigation in the Global South. And this is what the presentation will be focusing on. So to start off with, the emergence of climate change litigation, what are we looking at in terms of some facts and some figures? And I'll just set it out as a kind of an introduction. Climate change litigation has emerged in over 28 countries, including the European Union as a region, across all geographical regions, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. There have been more than 1,000 cases filed in the US alone, and over 300 filed in other jurisdictions. Here I set up some of these headlines that have cast climate litigation into the mainstream media, has given a lot more mainstream attention to what has been happening in the courtroom when it comes to climate change. And one of the most recent cases has been one a sort of a victory against a major oil and gas company, Shell. This was a case that was heard in the Dutch Supreme Court in July this year. And for the first time, a major oil and gas company was being told by a court that it needed to increase its climate ambitions and take on more ambitious decarbonization targets. Now, when we talk about climate litigation, climate change litigation is pretty much seen as a part of an advocacy strategy. So in that regard, the litigation is often accompanied by a fairly large, well-organized public relations strategy in order to raise awareness of climate change and what kind of issues needed to be addressed by a particular government or by a particular corporation. It's also seen as a regulatory strategy to the extent that the litigation is intended to put pressure on governments and corporations to up its corporate climate action. Climate litigation is not just a phenomenon that's been happening in developed countries. We now see climate litigation in the Global South as well. And in Asia, climate litigation has occurred or is occurring in a whole list of countries. And here I set out some of them: China, India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, as well as Taiwan. Now, when we look at climate change litigation, a couple of key ideas here that I just wanted to kind of background. First of all, we talk about core versus periphery cases, by which we mean that by core cases, we're looking at cases where climate change is really central to the litigation. So for example, a case where the litigants argue that the environmental impact assessment for a power plant project is inadequate because the assessment failed to take into consideration climate change impacts or the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the project. That's a core case. Climate change is really core to the litigation, to the lawsuit. Periphery cases are really looking at cases where climate change is one of a number of issues being addressed by the litigants. So for example, in cases associated with enforcement of forestry laws, the core case, I mean, the main case theory is focused on forestry, but climate change is really one of the issues that's being addressed as well, because there is such a close link between deforestation and climate change. Increasingly, we're talking about strategic climate litigation, by which we mean that the litigation is really explicitly acknowledged to have the strategic intention of forcing climate change action. And these are pro-regulatory actions, really. So when we talk about climate change litigation, Previously, because of the, people would think of it as a bunch of, interesting cases in various courts. But today we can talk about it as a phenomenon where you have a distinct regulatory role, where these cases are really having an impact on climate change policy across multiple levels of governance, international, local, as well as regional. And there is also, of course, a strong relationship with the Paris Agreement on climate change, in the sense that the country's nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, are being used to provide a framework for litigants. So litigants are going to court and are saying, this country has said that in its NDC that it would reduce climate change, greenhouse gas emissions by X amount, and it has failed to do so. And the litigants are holding their national governments accountable for their international treaty obligations, which is a really interesting phenomenon that we're witnessing, particularly in the last 2 years. Now, when we talk about climate change litigation, a lot of it is, we can talk about it in terms of the direct effects of the litigation, as well as the indirect effects. When we talk about the direct effects, we're really focusing on trying to measure or try to trying to understand the regulatory change that is attributable to the lawsuit. But there are also many indirect effects of the litigation. By indirect effects, we're talking about the raising of public awareness, the mobilization of public sentiment on the issue, and also creating leverage to supplement other non-litigation strategies, especially in back channel conversations with major corporations and governments on their decarbonization strategies. Now, when we look at some of the key trends in climate change litigation, most of the litigation has involved statutory pathways. So really looking at how major environmental law statutes provide litigation hooks for climate issues. The primary focus has been on governments. About 90% of cases has been against governments, but there is increasing action against corporations. And I just spoke about the major lawsuit against Shell that was a real victory for climate change activists in July this year. Now, most cases have involved climate change mitigation, but increasingly we do have a growing body of case law focusing on climate adaptation. Here I set out some of the, sorry, let me just move this away. Some of the common pathways that climate litigation have taken. So starting from the right-hand column, failure of environmental impact assessment, EIA, to take climate change impacts into account. There's a sizable body of case law on that. And it's particularly starting because with a growing body of case law in the United States and Australia about how environmental impact assessment today should be taking into account climate change impacts. There's also the possibility of suing private corporations in negligence, so in that sense, using private law, and the public trust doctrine. The public trust doctrine, very briefly, is an ancient concept. It was founded in Roman law. The idea that the state holds natural resources on trust for its people, and therefore needs to take into account the best interests of its people in its management of the environment and natural resources. This public trust doctrine can be found in most legal systems across the world. And so there's a lot of interest right now in trying to revive this doctrine as a basis for governmental obligations and responsibility to address climate change. Moving on to the left side of the column, the left column, there are a number of cases, there are quite a number of cases where the climate change litigation takes the form of challenges of local planning laws. And then that's, of course, enforcement of forestry laws, mining laws, that tends to feature very heavily in the Brazilian case law and as well as the Indonesian case law when it comes to climate change. And rights-based litigation. Rights-based litigation is really becoming an increasingly popular strategy. The idea behind this body of case law is really that the litigant is arguing that the government's failure to address climate change is amounting to a violation of the citizens' right to life, which in many constitutional systems has been interpreted to include the right to live in a clean environment. In addition to that, many Global South national constitutions include the right to a clean environment explicitly in their constitution, which provides yet another basis for a constitutional challenge. Here are the Global South jurisdictions where climate change litigation has occurred. Now, across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, to the best of my knowledge and as accurate as of today, litigation has happened in 17 Global South jurisdictions. You will note that there are no cases currently in the Pacific or the Caribbean, and or in the Middle East. Now, what am I currently looking at, and what is one of the things that I'm interested in trying to understand when it comes to climate change litigation in the Global South? Well, first of all, it is very clear that when we talk about climate change litigation in the Global South, it's not happening across the entire Global South. It's happening in a subset of 17 countries, which are the middle income countries. They are not the least developed countries, and they're not the more upper middle income countries. As middle income countries, these countries tend to face a common set of challenges, even though they vary significantly economically, culturally, politically. What is this common set of challenges that middle income countries tend to face? Well, one, maintaining sustainable economic growth while curbing rising income inequality and environmental degradation. A good example would be India. India is the second largest country in the world by population. It is home to over 100, I think at last count it's like 119 billionaires. India is home to 119 billionaires, but at the same time, 63 million people are pushed into poverty because of healthcare costs every year. So it's a deeply unequal country. And similarly, South Africa is the same. These countries tend to face significant difficulties providing a safety net for their citizens who tend to be adversely affected by globalization and rapid economic transformation. Corruption is rampant, and state institutions tend to be weak. And it's a challenge for many of these countries to maintain social and political instability, particularly when you look at the Latin American political regimes. So what this happens is that with these conditions, it tends to be what has been described as a perfect storm for strategic litigation. You have a legal system that provides an institutional framework for litigation. And in some countries, the judges are deemed to be the defenders of rights and are highly regarded, especially in comparison to other public sector employees. So you have a legal system that provides the framework for litigation, and at the same time, conditions of life that are really challenging for a lot of people, and that generates disputes and demands that become major cases. So when we look at this sort of situation, this kind of dynamics, we see that the strategic litigation in a lot of these countries then becomes the vehicle for climate change litigation. So what are some of the key characteristics of climate change litigation in the Global South? So climate change litigation in the Global South is emerging about 20 years after that in the Global North. And I would argue that there are some key characteristics that distinguish climate change litigation in the Global South. First is the prevalence of rights-based claims. As I've mentioned earlier, many national constitutions of Global South countries contain environmental rights, as well as the right to life, which has been interpreted in a way that includes the right to a clean environment. And that provides a basis. In contrast, the Constitution of the United States, Australia, and most European countries do not make any references to environmental rights. And of course, the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. Now, another key characteristic of climate litigation in the Global South has been a preference for enforcing the laws that are already on the books, rather than pushing for new or better climate laws. Because what we see is that in these cases, the plaintiffs are trying to address what they perceive to be fundamental drivers of climate change, which are poor enforcement of basic environmental laws. For example, air pollution laws are not being properly enforced, badly enforced water pollution laws, all of which are problems that are exacerbated by climate change. So what we find is that while in the global north, the vast majority of cases really involve civil society actors going to court and saying, look, the government needs to introduce better climate change laws or needs to introduce new climate change laws. We don't see that very often in the global south. In fact, that's only one case in the docket of about 300 cases. Now, when we talk about the final characteristic, I think, is what we call stealthy climate litigation. In other words, we find that a lot of the cases tend to package climate change with less controversial claims, such as enforcement of air pollution laws, which is fundamentally, kind of basic for most countries. Why is it done? I would hypothesize that one of the key reasons for doing so is to dilute the political potency of climate issues in some jurisdictions, and also because there are some countries where the judiciary feels constrained not to venture into what is deemed to be policy making. And climate policy making can be, climate litigation inevitably involves some elements of climate policy making. And judges feel uncomfortable with that. And so in such cases, we see litigants very, very carefully framing their submissions in ways that that allow the climate issue to kind of go very quietly under the radar, but still achieving action on climate litigation, on the climate front. Now, what I have identified what we have identified in our research has been that what are the ways that climate litigation is emerging in the global south? And here we posit 5 modes of climate change litigation in the global south. I'm just going to briefly speak to each of them as I'm aware of the constraints of time. The first would be the grassroots activists. This is particularly the case in South America and in South Asia. This grassroots activist really refers to local activists and community groups suing governments or companies to realize more ambitious climate action. We have been tracking the level of cooperation, transnational cooperation, whether it's with other NGOs in other global south jurisdictions or with other actors from global north jurisdictions. And we find there's very little. They are really grassroots groups. They're quite small, but because of a tradition of public interest litigation, they're able to gain access to the courts. Then you have the hero litigator, basically a dominant figure, a cause lawyering. This is basically the cause lawyer. The hero litigator sees him or herself as some unequivocal force for good and takes on the case as a part of almost like a moral quest to fight for climate justice. The farmer, basically we use the term the farmer to refer to how foundations, for example, the Ford Foundation, provides funding to local lawyers and environmental NGOs to seed cases. And it's kind of the basis for significant local capacity building and could have a positive multiplier effect. The engineer is basically one where he's seeking to multiply a strategy. So for example, you have a case that has been very, very successful in the global north, one of which is known as the case of Ahender versus the government of the Netherlands. And because it was such a successful case strategy, we are witnessing certain NGOs going around trying to replicate Ahender in various countries. In Asia, in Latin America, and Africa, we see the same. And finally, the enforcer. The enforcer will be looking at prosecutors or government agencies bringing lawsuits to enforce local laws. And we often see extensive cooperation between local environmental NGOs and these enforcers in order to support this body of litigation. And We're seeing that a lot in Brazil, and China is trying to build a similar model with the establishment of their environmental prosecution service. So that takes me to the end of my presentation, where I just wanted to end with this quote. The idea behind this quotation really is that over the years, it's easy to think that because the developments in the global South would replicate familiar patterns of knowledge diffusion, sort of premise on the idea that the global South would learn and receive resources from the advanced North. And my body of research seeks to resist this temptation. I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from developing countries, and therefore opportunities for multi-directional learning, like how we can all learn from each other, rather than the assumption we'll always be learning from the developed countries. And with that, I end. Thank you very much for your attention.